Okay, so I see a couple people are still joining, but I think we can go ahead and get started with the webinar. Hello, everyone. My name is Gabrielle Walton. I'm the Federal Campaigns Coordinator here at CCAN. Thank you so much for joining us tonight to talk about the threats to FEMA in the age of the climate crisis today. And yeah, I'm super excited to be joined by our fantastic panelists who are going to talk a bit more about the role of FEMA and disaster relief and the specific threats that Virginians face as the climate crisis accelerates. But yeah, super excited to be chatting with you all. And this meeting is being recorded, so if you happen to need to log off early, you'll be able to access it once the webinar is finished. And we also will be sharing the slides for your reference once we're all finished up. So now I'll ask Kadest to share the slides, please. Okay. So, welcome everyone. Again, my name is Gabrielle Walton. I'm the Federal Campaigns Coordinator here at CCAN, and I'll be guiding us all through this webinar tonight. You can advance to the next slide, Kadest. So here's our agenda tonight. I'm going to start with, of course, welcoming everyone, and I'll also be opening our topic for today. Then after I've finished up talking about why we're here, I'll pass it over to our speakers, which includes Emma Kelly from Appalachian Voices, Kevin Zidak, also from Appalachian Voices, and Genevieve Gary from Wetlands Watch. At the end, we'll have time for a Q&A, so please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A function, which you can find below in the same bar where you see the chat. And there you can add in any questions. We'll get to those at the end, and I'll invite all of our panelists to answer. So you'll hear from a variety of experts on the topic to satisfy your curiosity or clear up any concerns you might have. So yeah, that's a little bit of the agenda, and now we can move on to the content. So I want to start by talking about why we're here today. We're here to talk about FEMA, to talk about the state of disaster relief and how it's continually changing among many other changes that are happening on the federal level. But we're also here to talk about the role Virginia plays as federal disaster relief changes and the role of the FEMA Council and Governor Glenn Youngkin, who was appointed to the FEMA Council. So that's what we're going to be discussing over the course of the next almost 60 minutes. But I do want to take a step back and talk about what exactly FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is. You can move on to the next slide. So, what is FEMA and how does it respond during a disaster? I'm going to talk about what FEMA exactly does, what its origins are, and what its relationship to the FEMA Review Council is. Next slide. So, the origins of FEMA. FEMA goes way back to the 1970s, and it was actually set up through Jimmy Carter, who established it via executive order in 1979. But this was not the first form of disaster relief legislation. President Nixon signed the Disaster Relief Act of 1974, which established the process for a presidential disaster declaration. Then in 1988, Congress expanded FEMA's authorities with the Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Amendments of 1988, which also took the Disaster Relief of 1974 and renamed it as the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, also known as the Stafford Act. Following this, FEMA jumped forward to 2002. FEMA was moved into the Department of Homeland Security in the wake of 9/11, when President George W. Bush signed the Homeland Security Act. So that's a little bit about the origins of FEMA, where it even comes from, and this shows that it's been around for a while, with its most significant origins being in the 1970s. So moving on to the next slide. So now to talk a little bit about what exactly FEMA does. FEMA provides training and educational.
Sorry for the technical difficulties, folks. It seems like Gabby is having internet problems. We have her back. All right.
I am sorry, everyone. I'm not sure what happened to my internet connection, but I will continue. I imagine that I got cut off before finishing exactly, like getting through everything I was talking about what FEMA does. But so I'm going to backtrack a little bit to revisit some of the points above. Essentially, I was saying that FEMA provides training year round, so it's not only there when disaster strikes. It provides us to emergency managers, community organizations, and local governments. It also provides assistance to disaster survivors, local, state, and state governments, and nonprofits that provide essential services in the wake of a disaster and afterwards. Then, during disasters and in preparation before, it can deploy search and rescue teams and other human resources and support state led disaster recovery centers. It also offers grant funding to state and local governments to mitigate the risk of future disasters. And it manages the National Flood Insurance Program, which individuals can purchase. So that's just a bird's eye view of what FEMA does. I really want to make sure that that is understood and, at least introduced, because it'll also set up our future conversations about possible changes to FEMA and what the administration is working to currently do to change FEMA further down the line. Next slide. So now that we've established what FEMA does, it's now important for us to talk about exactly what the FEMA Review Council is. And this, again, is relevant because this is where Virginia comes in. This is where a lot of the different dynamics that have been swirling around FEMA come to meet. So I want to make sure that that is understood because that'll also inform our panelist conversations about the needs that Virginians are experiencing with regards to ways FEMA could be better and also what it did offer that has been changing and also what changes are needed for us to get on track with our emergency response needs. So next slide. So, the FEMA Review Council was created recently. On January 24th, 2025, President Trump established the FEMA Review Council via executive order. And according to the Department of Homeland Security's webpage, its goal is to advise the president on the existing ability of FEMA to capably and impartially address disasters occurring within the United States and shall advise the president on all recommended changes related to FEMA to best serve the national interest. And in November, it is going to submit a final report with recommendations as to what to do with FEMA to President Trump. So that part is really important about they will advise the president on all recommended changes related to FEMA to best serve whatever the national interest may be, because there have been already a number of suggestions floated by the administration on what to do with FEMA. So I want to situate a bit I want to situate the FEMA Review Council in a bit of context by describing what members of the administration have already described as their ideal way to deal with FEMA. Next slide. So on January 24th, NBC reported that President Trump went to a hurricane recovery briefing in Fletcher, North Carolina, and stated that he would also be signing an executive order to begin the process of fundamentally reforming and overhauling FEMA, or maybe getting rid of FEMA. I think, frankly, FEMA is not good. And as a reminder to many on the call who are likely already aware, this was in the wake of Hurricane Helene. And of course, as many may know, FEMA's response in Helene was widely criticized, and this led to many calling for FEMA's reform or its abolition. And as exemplified by this quote, President Trump was also one of the people who was voicing an interest in these major, major changes. Similarly, on June 26, NPR reported that Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem stated that at the first meeting of the FEMA Review Council that the president and I have had many, many discussions about this agency. I want to be very clear. The president wants it eliminated as it currently exists. He wants a new agency. So I think these quotes do a really good job at showing generally what the attitude has been for FEMA leading up to the FEMA Review Council, and as it continues to exist. Of course, this rhetoric has shifted a little bit in the wake of the Texas floods, but the FEMA Review Council is still, charging forward with its work, which I'll talk a little in the subsequent one side about also what Governor Youngkin has been doing on the FEMA Review Council. Next slide. So, why is Virginia even in this conversation? Well, that's because Governor Youngkin was appointed to the FEMA Review Council by President Trump. He serves on the council and is also on a subcommittee that will report on how localities and other government agencies or departments outside of FEMA respond during disasters. And he was quoted in the Virginia Mercury on July 10th as having stated that we will be receiving inputs from governors, from local leaders, from emergency response personnel, and of course from the Review Council itself. I think we will be able to chart a very clear delineation of the way things work today. And Youngkin noted the deep challenges of FEMA's current system and the group's goal to shift responsibility to the states and therefore move FEMA from being a supplant role into a support role. And I really want to note that last little phrase, that the shift of responsibility to the states and therefore move FEMA from being a supplant role into a support role. Because, as I mentioned earlier, the legislation requires that states make a formal request to the president to declare a major disaster declaration. And on that note, local emergency response is already the first line of defense. So that shift of responsibility, I think, is also a key part of this conversation, especially because of the key funding that the federal government provides to many emergency departments across the country, especially those that are the least equipped to respond to the increasing scale and severity of disasters. Next slide. So just to go a little bit further into that last point, I want to clear up a couple of items regarding federal and local funding. Local emergency responders are the first line of defense. And I included a quote from a article by Smart Cities Dive, which goes over a lot of different issues pertaining to cities. And it states that during a disaster, FEMA's assistance can only begin after a state requests an emergency declaration and the president approves it. And the request has to show that the disaster is so severe that the state can't handle the response completely on its own. It has to show to the president that it's overwhelmed, that its resources have been exhausted. And this procedure is formally established through the Stafford Act. So just to make that quite clear, the local emergency responders are the first line of defense of a disaster. And as I also stated, federal funding supports many local emergency departments. And the Department of Energy did a recent national study that was published this past July that surveyed a number of emergency response departments across the country and found that many of them are being kept afloat by FEMA funding. And the study quoted one director of an emergency department who stated that without the current use of the emergency management performance grants from FEMA, I would have to close my doors. It literally helps me keep the lights on. Without these grants, we would no longer be able to stay open. This isn't the case for every area across the country, particularly in states that have more funding to direct towards a more comprehensive emergency response, but it's certainly the case that many depend on support from FEMA in order to continue their operations. Now to the next slide. So with that in mind, I want to talk just really briefly about what is happening to FEMA right now. As I mentioned, the Trump administration has already launched a number of actions affecting a number of federal agencies, not just FEMA, but I do want to cast a spotlight on the changes that are already occurring despite the work of the FEMA Review Council and the upcoming report. Next slide. So really briefly, FEMA has already been struggling to develop its workforce with the Government Accountability Office reporting in 2023 that it had fallen short of its target since 2019. So over a 4-year gap, it had continuously fell short of its staffing target, and they identified that that gap continued to grow. So that was as of 2023. Flash forward to April 2025, when Doge cuts are, happening every day. About CNN reported that about 20% of FEMA's permanent full-time staff, which was around 1,000 workers, were expected to take later. In August, the Washington Post reported that FEMA had already lost about 2,000 people in recent months, with the Department of Homeland Security transferring more than 1,000 people to ICE, which was half of FEMA's Human Resources Department and about 50 people from its security team. So we're seeing significant reductions in human resources, and capacity. And then also with that are major funding concerns, and most notably is the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program cancellation, which was created in 2018 during the first Trump presidency and was used to fund evacuation shelters, flood walls, and other improvements that improve local resiliency. Since 2021, $4.5 billion went to 2,000 projects from thanks to BRIC. And in July, 20 states sued in response, and a federal judge ordered in August that the BRIC funds not be redistributed and canceled. So we're seeing that quite a few changes are disrupting our ability to respond to disasters on the federal level, including a cessation of funds to states. And this leaves a lot of local emergency departments in a state of uncertainty, especially as we approach peak hurricane season. Next slide. So now with that very bird's eye view, but also very heavy introduction, I want to pass it over to our panelists who are going to talk about a number of different ways this is going to impact Virginians, and also to provide some key background to talk about what is happening and what we do moving forward. And I'm going to start by passing a question over to Emma Kelly from App Voices. What has been the experience with FEMA leading to this point? How could it be improved and changed?
Thanks. So I have slides to talk about that. If we can get them up and going. Perfect. Thank you. So good evening, everybody. My name is Emma Kelly. I am the New Economy Program Manager at Appalachian Voices, and I work down here in far Southwest Virginia. So not Roanoke, not Abingdon, but the absolute corner of the state down here in the coal fields. And today I'm just going to give a little bit of an overview of our organization's limited experience with FEMA, where our work has intersected with theirs, and our experience with their response in our communities. So I do want to be clear, this is not a comprehensive overview of all of the work they've done in our area. It's limited a lot to community engagement and flood mitigation work. Next slide. For folks who are unfamiliar with far Southwest Virginia, we have had 4 federally declared weather-related disasters since 2021. It's been split between flooding and landslide events and winter storms, although the winter storms result in flooding, so really it's all water damage happening. And you can see the pictures on the left. The top is taken in August of 2022 up in Buchanan County, which was the second year in a row that they had a federally declared disaster from really devastating flooding. So that was taken from a community member's backyard where she had consistent erosion from the floods that was threatening the foundation of her house. Below is a photo from February of this year in Pennington Gap in Lee County when the North Fork of the Powell had flash flooding. And it actually, you can kind of see it cut off an access road to the community of Dot. So in our area, these disasters and the response to them is complicated by a lot of factors, including really aging and degraded infrastructure. Our landscape is damaged from a history of resource extraction. We have destabilized soil. Our land is not able to absorb water the way it should. We also just live in the mountains. We have a steep topography, which exacerbates the risk of flash flooding. And finally, we have a very low community response capacity. A lot of our communities are run by volunteers. A lot of our EMS is run by volunteers. And of course, as a lot of emergency management services are, they are chronically underfunded. We have an aging population. We have areas that don't have cell signal or Wi-Fi. And all of that makes disaster response and doing a good coordinated response really difficult in this area. I did also just want to throw COVID-19 in there as a federal disaster that FEMA played a role in allocating some healthcare funding for our area. Next slide. So as an organization, and specifically my team within Appalachian Voices down here in Southwest, how have we worked with FEMA? Not with direct disaster aid. I stuck that in there because I thought people might be curious. We don't do that kind of work. Sometimes I have directed people to where they can find the applications, but nothing extensive. The two programs I'm really going to talk about is Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, which was just mentioned, and the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. And I'm going to talk about both of those in the community of Pound, which is a small community in Wise County. It's about 850 people. And from a disaster standpoint, it's very vulnerable. The majority of downtown sits in the floodplain. It had mining and logging geographically all around it. The population is vulnerable in terms of ability, in terms of income. Again, it is a heavily aging population. So it's high risk when it comes to disasters. For the BRIC program, that provides grants, but also technical assistance. And Pound was lucky enough to get one of the technical assistance packages. So there was no money tied to it, but there was 36 months, 3 whole years of targeted technical assistance from FEMA for gathering and analyzing data, gathering resources. And ultimately, what the town decided was they needed a hazard mitigation plan, an evacuation plan, and an emergency warning system. Because as it stands, when there is a disaster, like I said, there's cell phone signal gaps. It's really hard to make sure everybody is aware and can get out safely. This was an incredibly big deal, not just for Pound, but for our entire area. And in January, FEMA sent a team down to our area. They were wonderful. They spent a day doing stakeholder meetings, talking to the community, walking around, and doing their own sort of ground mapping of hazards that we might not have clocked. And we were very excited for this. And then it was terminated around March or April of this year. And I don't have an exact date because we were not notified of the termination so much as we were ghosted. So we had been really planning on that technical assistance to set us up for several hazard mitigation projects in the future, largely looking at state funding sources to do the actual implementation. And now a lot of that is on hold indefinitely. The other main thing that we work with is the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which FEMA oversees nationally, but in Virginia goes through the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. So in 2015, there was Tropical Storm Michael. It hit Pound pretty hard. Again, they had a lot of flash flooding, and they had the landslide that you can see in the picture on the right. So that is a pretty major landslide. It's in the center of town, also in the floodplains. That's fun. It's at a major intersection, and you can see at the top there is a church. So there's also a pretty decently trafficked residential road that goes along the top. The town submitted an application for a 2-phase landslide stabilization. Like I said, back in 2019, it was approved by FEMA in 2022 or by VDEM. That delay is not FEMA's fault. The town was undergoing some bureaucratic changes at that point. But the important thing is it was approved in 2022, and we still do not have a retaining wall in the center of town. We heard a month ago that it was undergoing EHS review and that approval was imminent. So we've got our fingers crossed. But this has been, for several of our localities, a really important grant program for addressing those major imminent threats that result from a lot of the disasters. Next slide. So specifically, and I'm not meaning to beat up on FEMA here, but what hasn't worked for our homes here in Southwest Virginia? Like I just hinted at, pace. So this is not about their recovery teams and the people they send in immediately after disaster. The on-the-ground response time is fantastic, and those people do an amazing job in a time of high stress and complex logistics. It is the longer-term recovery and mitigation funding that poses an issue. In my line of work, we expect a devastating flood in one of our communities at least once a year. Not necessarily a federally declared disaster, but a significant flooding event that will take months to recover from. We need that funding for mitigation projects to be readily accessible so that we can get a shovel in the ground as soon as possible. Because if it's never built, it's never actually going to do the mitigation work. And you get stuck in the cycle of response, which is currently what we're in now. We also struggle a lot with the requirements for individual assistance, and there's a couple key components to that. Virginia has a higher threshold to qualify for individual assistance because the other side of the state is rich, right? The coal fields is an impoverished region. And when you look at other areas that have a similar economic circumstance, West Virginia and Kentucky, on the other side of the border, they tend to have a lower threshold to qualify. So what this means is even when we have a declared disaster that takes livelihoods, that washes away folks' homes, a lot of times people can't get that individual assistance because our property has a lower value. The other thing, which I think is really a really sensitive thing for rural areas specifically, is property ownership and deeds. Of course, we have a lot of generational residents. They live on generational land, land that maybe their great grandma got, and then it's been passed down and split up and sent to family friends, and deeds have been lost, and other deeds have been drawn, and there's been new surveys. And what that all boils down to is not adequate paperwork to show to FEMA to get that individual assistance. A lot of times we get told go to the courthouses. A lot of our courthouses don't have those records either. So there's a real gap in the paperwork requirements and then what people after a disaster can reasonably respond with. The final thing that I think will resonate with everybody is simple on-the-ground confusion navigating agencies. So I've got a mixture of federal and state agencies listed here, but post-disaster, it really turns into a kind of alphabet soup where people are trying to track down the resources that they know are there and the resources that are due to them, and they get bounced from agency to agency, from federal to state, back to federal. And so there is a real need to figure out a disaster agency that can really step in, take point, and help more clearly delineate the lines of responsibility to impacted people who are trying to navigate this system. So this is all to say, even with these issues, FEMA has played an incredibly important role in helping our area. And that is why it's so important that we have a reform bill and we don't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. That is all I have. So I think now I pass it over to Kevin to talk a little bit more about FEMA.
Sorry, everyone. My camera was taking a billion years to load, but yes, that is correct. We're going to pass it over to Kevin, and thank you so much for sharing that presentation, Emma. It was super enlightening also to see exactly what on the ground people are experiencing. And on that note, Kevin, I want to ask you, how are these cuts to disaster, or these changes also to disaster relief, impacting Virginians? Can states fill the gaps in emergency response that FEMA provides?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Gabby. Hi, everyone. So my answer, as folks have said, I'm also with Appalachian Voices with Emma. I am on our government affairs team, so looking kind of at the relationship as Gabby laid out earlier between FEMA and state and local partners. So one of the biggest impacts, the most immediate thing to come to mind, is the current administration has halted delivery of the hazard mitigation grant funding to declared disasters this year. And that includes uh, pretty severe flooding in Southwest Virginia in February. So, through the regular process, as Gabby laid out, Governor Youngkin applied for that disaster declaration. Disaster declaration was issued for public assistance, did not meet the threshold for individual assistance, but the current administration has frozen hazard mitigation grant funding. So in regular order, that funding accompanies a disaster declaration that gives funding to states to implement disaster mitigation strategies. So that can include developing hazard mitigation plans, and also rebuilding infrastructure in a way that reduces or mitigates future losses. So Southwest Virginia has not received that funding. And as we enter hurricane season, to take a kind of a statewide approach, while Southwest Virginia hasn't received that funding, we're entering hurricane season that can heavily impact the eastern part of the state, as well as we know from last fall when Hurricane Helene still impact the southwest part of the state. So we don't yet know what the full extent of this policy change is going to be, other than it's really taking away one of those tools for communities to develop resilience to future storms. Gabby also hit on the fact that the administration has suspended, is the word I will choose today, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. There is debate about whether those grants are canceled or paused, or in the ether somewhere. But the currently that funding has been repealed, and the administration is also slow walking flood mitigation assistance funding. So flood mitigation assistance grants are mandatory spending. I saw some recent analysis that points to the first 7 months of the calendar year 2025 versus calendar year 2024. There's a difference about $480 million from flood mitigation assistance nationwide, not just in Virginia, but Virginia obviously benefits from those programs. So there's a difference in $480 million from flood mitigation assistance not going out in 2025. And even in those numbers, it's important to note that 86% of that funding that did go out was awarded in January. So flood mitigation assistance has been really slow walked. BRIC, it was about $358 million difference between last year and this year, and 70% of that was in January. So since January and the new administration, we are seeing these funds greatly restricted. Emma mentioned the community of Pound participating in direct technical assistance with BRIC. It was the only community in Virginia to receive that award, to have that on-the-ground presence, working with them, low capacity community, and walking through that, which is such a valuable program for communities. And Emma mentioned it's about 800 people, median household income around $28,000. So those are the communities that we really want to see these kind of support programs for, across the state in Southwest Virginia, that no longer have access to that funding. So that's just to hit on hazard mitigation grants, flood mitigation assistance, and the BRIC program, and kind of where that funding is drying up. Can states fill the gaps in emergency response that FEMA provides? That is really tough. And there are ways that Virginia is positioned well for this conversation, and ways that I think folks in DC are kind of positioning future efforts to encourage states to take on a larger role. There is kind of a conversation in, we'll say it's academic circles, about the value of increased state investments in resilience and disaster mitigation, disaster recovery programs. Um, but when we're talking about the idea of a wholesale ending of FEMA, that really doesn't bode well for kind of a long-term process. So in Virginia specifically, there are two recovery programs, the State Public Assistance Grant Program and the Virginia Disaster Relief Fund, that are state programs that without a FEMA disaster declaration, folks might qualify for. The Virginia Disaster Relief Fund is pretty new. That was set up recently and was actually focused on southwestern Virginia communities recovering from Hurricane Helene. It does have a cap of $30,000 per household, which is about $13,000 less than FEMA's cap of individual assistance. Governor Youngkin did expand the eligibility for that program to also cover those February storms. But this is a new program, which is to say, if we were having this conversation last year at this time, we wouldn't be talking about it. So we are really seeing states kind of add these additional programs. The state public assistance grants also has kind of the equation to it, where your local damage costs have to be $4 times your population to qualify, which for smaller communities might sound like kind of a big hurdle. For a pound Virginia, that would be like $3,200, which seems like okay, then the state can step in um, and support that as well. Folks have mentioned the Community Flood Preparedness Fund as another state fund that folks on this call might be familiar with, kind of a controversial fund. Its funding has historically come from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative auction of carbon dividends, but recently the state has been putting general fund money towards that. So in that way, Virginia has moved forward on having state programs. It's still not to the scale of FEMA, to be clear. Gabby mentioned her introduction. FEMA also administers the National Flood Insurance Program. Virginia doesn't have a state flood insurance program as other states do. So that would be something really difficult to administer at the state level. The training piece, the multi-agency coordination is really difficult for a state to do for different federal programs that might not be FEMA, but are the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program out of the Housing and Urban Development Department, the federal Housing and Urban Development Department. And just to wrap it up, I'll leave on a little bit of hope. There are efforts in Congress. Emma mentioned some reform work. There is a bill being considered in the House of Representatives, the Fixing Emergency Management for Americans Act, that is really trying to get out ahead of this narrative of the administration's narrative about eliminating FEMA. For states like Virginia, there's an increased cost share because of the establishment of these accounts. So the federal government would pay more in recovery costs because the state has invested in building its resilience through these different funds. Can they do a lot more? Sure. Is it to the level of FEMA's flood mitigation assistance and hazard mitigation grants? No. So to consider the idea of eliminating those pots of funding entirely would still be really detrimental to states like Virginia. One other little tweak that I just want to shout out from that bill, we talked about the individual assistance element and how that was not approved for the February floods. That is estimated, according to the preliminary damage assessment, at about $5 million. But the FEMA reform bill includes some pieces that say, for economically distressed or rural areas, if the disaster declaration goes through, individual assistance is automatic. So that would also be a really exciting reform to supplement the work that Virginia is doing in improving its resilience at the same time as bolstering FEMA's presence. So I know I took that answer back into a swing of FEMA sticking around, but as we see two stories developing between Congress and the administration, I think it's important to weigh kind of how they're interacting. And Virginia is a better space than a lot of states, but certainly FEMA is still playing a major role in that.
Yes, thank you so much, Kevin. I think that was super enlightening and really fascinating. And I really appreciated that you also spotlighted that, yeah, Virginia is in a better position than many states. But yeah, these risks still threaten us all. And the picture is still pretty nuanced. But it's exciting also that glimmer of hope that Congress is seeking to answer this question as well. So yeah, thank you so much, Kevin. And now I'm going to invite our last speaker to present, and that is Genevieve Gary from Wetlands Watch. And Genevieve, I want to ask you, how might these threats worsen in Virginia without FEMA support, and as climate change accelerates, and who might be affected?
Hi, everyone. You can also call me Gigi if that is easier. And yes, I am from Wetlands Watch. I am the new on the new flood risk staff. For our organization, and if you don't know, we are a small nonprofit based out of Norfolk, but we work at every level of government from federal down to neighborhoods. And we really work to build resilience across the Commonwealth. And I work on the Communities Initiative. Just a little background, I am an integrative marine scientist, so I have a background in climate science. And so I like to think of Virginia as Emma and Kevin have mentioned, not just as coastal Virginia is seeing climate change impacts, but the whole state, as we've really seen with Hurricane Helene and other inland flooding from disasters that got declared in February from Governor Youngkin, that climate change is really going to affect us all across the state, and it's going to affect our pocketbook as well. And so part of my job at Wetlands Watch is we are the chair of the community rating system and work group, and that is part of the National Flood Insurance Program. And so what that does is that FEMA basically has communities do best practices and do flood resilience. And when they do that and they prove it through multiple different methods, which I'll talk about in a moment, which is a point system, is that the policy owners that have the NFIP policy, they will get a discount based on their community's rating. So if you have they all start at 0 when you join the program, and then they go up in 5% increments. So you get a 5% discount, a 10% discount, and so forth. And so we have 30 CRS communities across the state. They are more around the Hampton Roads area and around Northern Virginia, with a few out west. And so we have about 58,000 policies enforced and about $35 million in premiums. And so one of the ways in which we can combat climate change as a state is by preserving our environmental resources that provide us ecosystem services such as wetlands. And so one of the ways in which we have credits and we do better than the national average is what's known as Credit 420, which is preserving open space in the floodplain. And so that is our goal, is that we're actually using this federal policy, this federal program to preserve conservation. And so that is a risk with FEMA changing, is what is going to happen with the community rating system and what is going to happen to these policies, because a couple years ago they reformed the community rating system and created what is known as risk rating 2.0, where they actually created more equity with what a house is actually worth and what the premium should be, based off of multiple factors of the house, not just its specific location. And so, affordable flood insurance is really, really important. And because where it rains, it can flood. And so no matter where somebody is living in Virginia, they are susceptible to flooding. And so we want to make sure that people have access, to insurance, but we also want to make sure that that insurance actually covers enough of the actual costs as well. And that is something that I've looked into, because I believe we undervalue how much the health costs are when you have flooding. And it's also missing some in the insurance that within the NFIP, they're missing some requirements such as environmental remediation. So if you've ever gone through an insurance claim on your home, you have to get rid of whatever happened, the damage first. And then if it's an older home, you can have lead found, asbestos, other things that then can harm, the owner of the household. And so that is something we really need to think about with FEMA, is what are they going to, since it's going to evolve or get changed, what is going to happen with this system? Currently, we work with multiple communities across the state that are trying to get better discounts for their policy owners, and they work on multiple levels, including flood messaging, having flood ordinances. And so with them having this pressure kind of from FEMA to document everything and go through this process, which takes a lot, and that is why we find that most of the CRS communities are communities that already have capacity to do so. And a goal of our organization is to get capacity to the ones that don't. But they have this pressure essentially to better their community, make sure you're not building in the floodplain, make sure we're having smarter buildings, and really emphasize using green infrastructure, saving that open space. And so, just to kind of, I could go on a long spiel about, Virginia and the climate impacts, but we have the highest rate of sea level rise on the East Coast. And that's something to think about when we stop insuring part of the state, that's going to affect policy owners in the western part of the state. We're already seeing that with California with fires and this is why you're having some internal human migration within the US is there are places that are uninsurable anymore. And therefore, we're all going to have kind of the burden of having our insurance policies go up, similar like you have for how you have car insurance. And so I think it's really important that, we think about these things and you think about it that the economics and the health and what is actually going on in the environment, they all are kind of tied together. And that we need to recognize that not every locality has the same capacity. And we really, Kevin and Emma have already kind of mentioned that Virginia isn't a good spot, but they really do need to make sure that they diversify their funding sources. Like for one example, the Coastal Zone Management Program in Virginia was fully funded by NOAA. And for most of the year, most people have been very concerned if that was even going to continue, because in Virginia, they were fully relying on NOAA funding and didn't have internal funding within, bringing in other pots of money to fund that program. And so it really is important that we diversify the funding. And also we set up a climate office. We are one of the only states that does not have a climate office. And so I will leave it with that. So we have some time for questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Genevieve. That was super, comprehensive, really fascinating, and also, very unsettling to think about the scale of human migration that may be coming, and also the different questions we have about home ownership and insurance. So thank you so much, Genevieve. That was really fascinating. So now, with the remaining time, with roughly 5 minutes, I want to devote that time to questions. I see that we already have two that were submitted through the Q&A function, and I want to make sure that everyone can see these now. We'll start with the first question. Are there opportunities to provide input to FEMA and the FEMA Review Council? If yes, do you have recommendations for providing effective input? I'll start as a member of CCAN. We have one thing that we'll be offering at the end. It's a petition to sign on to, but I also want to open it up to other speakers in case they know of other things that can be done to also make their voices heard regarding FEMA and the FEMA Review Council.
I don't mean to just leave the air awkward, but Gabby, I know you are fully plugged in and probably the best person to tell people how to provide their comments.
Yeah,
So take it away.
well, yeah, and like to be honest, it has like to be clear about like regarding some of the difficulties also in accessing that information, like because Kevin, you alluded to a silence. It just to draw on my personal experience, I found out at the second FEMA Review Council meeting that they were making these publicly accessible. So I just want to note that it has been a little challenging to identify exactly how to get input and also how to access these meetings. And for those who are interested, I saw that their upcoming meeting is on August 28th, and you can send an email to a contact information that they have publicly listed from FEMA asking to register to attend. So I want to offer that to the audience. Of course, you won't be able to say anything. It's just a live stream, but that's your opportunity to listen in. And also their most recent meeting, which happened in early July, is also available on C-SPAN to be rewatched. So to provide input, I would say it's our petition right now. I haven't seen any other opportunities yet. However, that doesn't mean they can't be created, they can't be sent in other ways. It's just not anything that I've seen super public facing on the part of FEMA's side. I think personal advocacy, there might be ways, but I haven't identified any other avenues at this moment, other than our petition and other than keeping up with their announcements and their meetings. Okay, so now moving on to a second question that was put in the chat. While this conversation is about natural disasters and the role of FEMA in addressing them, I'm curious about other emergencies/disasters such as cyber attacks or massive physical, including biochemical attacks or disasters. What is happening in those areas with FEMA? And I think this question could be helpful also just to understand generally what FEMA's role is, because if people on the call feel comfortable speaking on it, because FEMA doesn't just respond to natural disasters, but is also trained to respond to other kinds, as Emma mentioned with COVID.
I could partly answer. I was able to watch the second meeting on the review council that was held. I think that was back in July. Correct me if I'm wrong. And well, their tone definitely changed after Texas happened. Pete Hegseth would talked during this time and mentioned that the Department of Defense was basically there to support FEMA in any capacity. And so I read into that as for these other things that we have to consider for other disasters that are possible, that the DoD is probably more heavily involved in those aspects, especially given where some of our assets are along the coasts. So, but that is to go more into the biological chemical side of things, thinking back to when these started back, they started back in the 70s is when we had a lot of chemical disasters, Love Canal, other things. And we need to be concerned about the EPA as well as they pull back on regulations for chemicals, and that the FEMA might have to become more responsible as we don't have as stringent regulations on what can also be called controlled substances. So we should also push for the EPA to remain strict on chemicals.
Yeah, thank you, Genevieve. That is a very concerning thought, thinking about rollbacks and EPA control of substances. But I think that's super important to flag. And I think it falls completely in line with our overall advocacy, ensuring that the government provides guidance, provides resources to communities to protect them during these extreme events. And then we have one question, not directly related to FEMA, but about the Coast Guard and their role. Does anybody here feel, called to answer that question?
I guess I can, because I probably have the most experience with this living on the coast and as a marine scientist. I cannot speak so much for, I guess, the whole state, but I have seen their work in North Carolina, and they normally are very heavily involved with the local emergency departments. Normally in those meetings, if you've ever been to you have an emergency management center in some of these bigger counties that are along the coast, and you typically have a pretty good line to the Coast Guard. But that is a question. One of my colleagues is actually starting to teach at the Coast Guard Academy, and I could reach out to her if you would like more information on that.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'd be curious to know also, especially if this is something that'll be evolving as the emergency response landscape continues to change. So it looks like there are no further questions in the chat, but I want to thank everybody for submitting their questions, including the one about follow-up actions. This gets at our last item for tonight, which is our petition to Governor Youngkin, urging him to protect, but really to improve FEMA. As was mentioned, especially and highlighted in Emma's presentation, FEMA does have areas to be improved. It has ways it could be way better, way stronger, and get assistance directly to communities in their time of crisis, and especially in that long-term rebuilding process, which is especially naughty. So we drafted this petition urging Governor Youngkin not just to not get rid of FEMA, but also to improve it, because as shown by our panelists, there's a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of experience that from experts, also from survivors themselves who've gone through the disaster recovery experience, who know the ways in which it could be better, and know and do want it to be improved, while also acknowledging that they have had some adverse experiences or some delays, whatever you might call it. So we want to invite everybody to sign this petition, which is addressed at Governor Youngkin, and the link is in the chat, so you can access it fairly easily. And with that, I really want to say thank you to everybody for joining us tonight. I learned a lot. I hope you did as well, and I'm grateful again to our speakers from App Voices and from Wetlands Watch, to Kevin, to Emma, and to Genevieve for joining us tonight and sharing their expertise on this topic. And again, we'll get these slides to you for your reference, and please feel free to reach out to any of us with any additional questions. Again, thank you all so much for being with us, and I hope you all have a fantastic evening.